This video was requested by my dad. He's a former Navy corpsman, and we all know you'd better listen to Doc. Today we're going to crash course America's reputationally tarnished transportation transformer. Try saying that 3 times fast. The V-22 Osprey. This is the first military aircraft in the world to be mass-produced with a tilt-rotor system, which takes the massive engines on the wingtips and pivots them up or down to hover like a helicopter and fly like a plane. However, Benjamin Franklin is largely credited with the phrase, "Glass, china, and reputation are easily cracked and never well mended." And the Osprey has gotten a massive bad rap for being an airplane with a bias for gravity that often takes a lot of lives with it. And with the majority of the US fleet grounded for the last few years, a lot of people have only a single question: why did we even get this thing in the first place? While they had only been in service for a few years each by that point, in 1968, the U.S. Marine Corps already knew that the planned lifespan of the CH-46 Sea Knight and CH-53C Stallion assault helicopters would be just about over by the early 1990s. To address this, they proposed the HXM Replacement Assault Helicopter Program to get ahead of the curve and spend the next 2 decades making a successor, which already by itself, with the context of some of the other American aircraft acquired by the military during this time period, leaves the U.S. Marine Corps as, shockingly to probably no one, the most forward-thinking branch of Uncle Sam's cheek-kicking family tree. And because they appear to be the primary voice of common sense in the military family, nobody listened to them. While the Marines had already gone and set up the program, the Navy acknowledged it, but they didn't really care.
I recognize the Council has made a decision, but given that it's a stupid decision, I've elected to ignore it.
As the world went full steam ahead into the 70s, the Navy had a bunch of other priorities, like the F-14 Tomcat, the FA-18 Hornet, and the Nimitz-class nuclear supercarriers, not to mention funding the ongoing operations in Vietnam for the first few years. The only brand new aerial toy the Marines would get during this time was the AV-8A Harrier, starting with the first delivery in 1971. Just for reference, they had been mostly stuck using the original F-4B Phantoms that came out in the early 60s for pretty much the entire war, with maybe a dash of J models here and there. And the Marines can't just go out and buy things because they have to ask Mom for permission first, aka the Navy. They're not asking Dad because the Marines are already the men's department, and Mom knows good and well that if she lets the boys get up to no good, then Geneva's gonna need new rules to stop men from having shorter lifespans. Actually though, the reason is because the Marines pull a lot of funding for their development from Navy coffers. So every time the Marines want to go on an R&D field trip, the Navy has to sign off as a chaperone. Just don't tell the Marines I said that, they're not a fan of that line of thinking.
Guys, don't tell her I'm here!
All I'm saying is there's a reason the Marines are so well known for improvising things, and it's because they only get new toys their parents ask for, and half the time those toys were made for somebody else's needs first. And since the Navy was too busy buying their toys instead of more than one of any of the substantial air power things the Marine Corps needed, they would pretty much leave the program out by the side of the road and unfunded for about a decade. But the HXM would struggle on regardless, and whether the powers that be intended that or not, this bought the program enough time for the military to have a reason to pull out the old Uno reverse card. Because the end of that time frame would then coincide with the completion of the fallout of the Islamic Revolution in Iran, which flipped the script and played the fanatical card on the Iranian government on the 2nd of February 1979. By November of that year, the now very tense relations between the US and Iran had reached a breaking point when a bunch of overzealous college students stormed the US embassy in Tehran and took 63 Americans hostage. Over the next few months, some of those hostages had their releases negotiated, but by April of the following year, these negotiations had stalled out for almost 6 months, prompting the US to plan an extraction mission for the last 52 hostages called Operation Eagle Claw. This mission would see 8 CH-53C Stallion helicopters flying into Tehran to pick up the hostages and bring them back to the complete opposite coast of Iran where the US carriers were stationed. Problem was, because this was the complete opposite coast, they didn't have enough gas to make it there one way, so they had to set up a refueling stop with C-130s in the middle of the desert to bring everybody up to full tanks and continue.
But there's one thing you didn't account for.
Turns out Iranian weather's an absolute pain in the rear and the mechanicals, and it caused 2 helicopters to wear through their systems faster than planned and another to turn around before reaching the other end of a fierce sandstorm. It also didn't help that they somehow picked a spot that was right next to a civilian road, causing the mission to be first interrupted by a bus full of civilians. The bus was stopped and the people were disembarked without issue, but then an oil tanker crashed the party from the other direction direction, and it looked like it was not only going to not slow down, but also crash into the bus they'd stopped. With basically no other options and a potential suspicion of it being a rolling bomb, the Spec Ops guys factory reset to default aggressive settings and shot it until it blew the hell up. Except that caused a literal fire geyser to light up their entire postal code like the 4th of July on a covert mission. So the mission commander now has 5 out of 8 helis, 1 fewer than the required mission minimum, plus their positions probably being given off to the local satellite cameras, so they decide they can't afford to continue and the operation fails. And then, just to land the cherry on top, as they're getting ready to leave, one of the Sea Stallions crashes into a C-130 with all of its gas on board, lighting it on fire and killing 8 people.
Mission failed. We'll get them next time.
So that mission went spectacularly poorly, and now it's time to take the failure to town. And when you fail, what do? Right, you take everybody on the mission, throw them in jail, and pretend nothing ever I'm just kidding, that's the Communist Handbook. In America, you take that mission failure and study it religiously until it turns into something that never happens again. And upon studying the Eagle Claw debrief, one of the things they noticed was that trying to drop a gas station in the middle of the desert with Uncle Sam's signature collection created a failure point in the mission plan. Having to stop and get gas for your privately owned military transport helicopter leaves you reliant on a land base, which means you need both extra logistical support and, in the event of requiring the party to roll a stealth check, means you can be discovered. Also, Mother Nature's ability to turn her weather into a blindfold means that even the best pilots have to worry about overshooting the landing zone, running out of gas, and subsequently becoming a contribution to the climate of the topographical oven. So they would need a platform with a longer range, which helicopters as a whole were not known for. The only reason they selected a helicopter for the mission at all was because they needed to land in a small open area close to the embassy, like the Amjadin soccer field right across the street, to make that rescue a lot more in and out. And since the helicopters didn't work, it was now time to try modifying a plane to act like one instead. Enter Project Credible Sport, where the US strapped enough directional rocket engines to a C-130 to make the Rocinante blush and give the Hercules liftoff to and from a 300-foot takeoff run in that soccer field. Stop, I need you to understand something. The C-130 Hercules is just under 100 feet long, and they wanted to land this thing in a soccer field and take off loaded in about 3 C-130s worth of length.
I'ma just stop. And then I'm gonna exit.
This makes no sense, but thankfully this is America. We don't make sense, we make dollars, and so the military-industrial complex would take one look at rocket-assisted takeoff or RATO packs and say,
I'll take your entire stock!
They would then any percent speed run the entire R&D process, starting from the contract award in July of 1980 to being ready to launch a test flight in about 2 months. That is about 60 days from here's your money to here's your airplane. Even modifications like this typically take years to develop. The military-industrial complex is pricey as hell, but I'm starting to think that's probably because we genuinely pay them to make miracles occur. But that miracle had to survive the testing phase first, and so on September 18th, 1980, this XFC-130H would go for a test drive, during which the retro rockets kicked up so much smoke that the pilot lost visual on the ground. So he decided to just put that bird down as fast as possible and fired the remaining downwards rockets, which forced it down so fast that the right wing snapped. The experimental Herc would then crash, and while it wasn't fatal to anybody, the plane was a total loss. The military would then get to work trying out Take 2 Electric Boogaloo with the improved YMC-130H, but on the 31st of October, a negotiation deal was announced that would go on to see all hostages safely returned to the US. The entire US-Iran problem had cooled off by January of 1981, and consequently the US didn't need C-130s on RATO steroids anymore. But the last remaining test plane was so heavily modified, it would cost too much to put it back the way it was, so the government kinda just went,
That belongs in a museum!
and threw it on a pedestal in the Museum of Aviation on Robbins Air Force Base in Georgia. But even with the hostage crisis over, the failure of Eagle Claw still kept Uncle Sam awake at night, because he knew that if something like this happened again, there was nothing America had in its arsenal that could handle long-range special forces insertion and extraction by itself. Switch back to the HXM program. It's been almost a decade, and the Marine Corps' bid to make a meat missile that can fidget spin until it beats the air into submission is still being fully blueballed by the Navy. As a result of this stubborn lack of funding, in November of 1981, Congress elected to Control-Alt-Delete the Marines' HXM program from the fiscal year 1982 budget. They were worried that this would take too long and become too expensive, which would be disastrous for the Corps considering how long the Navy had left the project on the back burner. The Corps naturally decided to appeal this decision because, you know, in the wake of Eagle Claw, now they definitely needed the freaking helicopter, and that appeal goes right to the Secretary of the Navy at the time, John Lehman. Lehman, coincidentally, had just been to the Paris Air Show a few months ago and happened to see a demonstration featuring the XV-15 tilt-rotor research aircraft, or TRRA, which had been developed by the Bell Aircraft Company with support from the Army and NASA. And so he came back to the Marines and said that while he would not support reviving the existing program for the Marines alone, he would be happy to push out a technologically advanced inter-service platform. Combined with the still fresh sting of the dulled Eagle Claw, the US Navy and Air Force were now more than willing to fund the creation of a new longer-range assault transport VTOL aircraft, be it a standard helicopter or otherwise.
You were saying?
So, at the behest of the Deputy Secretary of Defense, Frank Carlucci, in 1981 the JVX program was officially started, as a nearly $4.5 million cooperation between the Army, Air Force, Navy, Marines, and even NASA. Everybody wanted a piece of the pie for their own reasons. The Army wanted a new Special Electronic Mission Aircraft, or SEMA plane, which is basically a glorified command and control platform capable of its own intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance duties, or ISR, and at the time were older fixed-wing aircraft. Because believe it or not, the Army does have more than just helicopters, they just don't blow stuff up with them most of the time. The Navy wanted a new search and rescue aircraft, the Air Force wanted the same as the Navy and a new special operations transport, and the Marines were finally gonna get their new meat missile. NASA was just along for the ride for the funsies they call research, because this will be a first-of-its-kind mass-produced platform, and that means aerospace physicists are gonna be drooling all over it, so you might as well give them an outlet. The branches would then start by fleshing out the best configuration for their newest toy from among four main types. First up is the conventional helicopter design, the one that primarily relies on the giant fans up top to provide thrust by gangster leaning its way through the air. Then there's the compound helicopter, which uses the big fans up top and a forward-pushing propeller for moving, straight up saying, "What, I need wings to fly?"
Who decided that?
Then there were fan and wing aircraft, which, as the name says, have propulsive lift fans in their wings, which basically would have looked something like this. Yeah, the US military was considering adopting an Avengers-style Quinjet as early as the 1980s. And last but not least, and in complete line with the American military-industrial complex and their crazy ideas, the fourth idea was to just build a Decepticon. This was the tilt-rotor aircraft, which would take the rotors and combine them with the design of propellers to make prop rotors, then mount them to a pair of engines which get tilted up and down to swap between helicopter and airplane modes. It's literally a transformer. All four ideas were considered from your typical military considerations: operational effectiveness, cost effectiveness, life cycle costs, survivability, and maintainability. In English, that means how much bang do you get, how much bang do you get for your buck, how many bucks does it cost to keep it, what kind of hits can it take, and how easy is it to put back together. Simple stuff. And after 4 months of study, the US military and NASA came to the decision that making Megatron into a troop transport was the best of all worlds. Congress would then approve of this plan and authorize funding on June 4, 1982, but the JVX program would then get blueballed again by the Secretary of Defense, Caspar Weinberger, because, according to him, brilliantly, the funding being allocated to the first aviation program probably in US history, if not in a long time, to ever be conjointly agreed upon and developed by all four offensive branches of the US military and NASA was better spent on other things.
God damn it!
Thankfully, the JVX was only stuck in the bureaucratic cuck chair for about a year before Congress threatened him with contempt of Congress charges to get him to actually send the funding the program was supposed to get. And from there, it was finally full steam ahead to make the desired 1,086 JVX aircraft. At least that was the plan before the Army left. The Army had begun reviewing their mission requirements and realized they needed a bigger and more powerful plane than everybody else because of the ISR package combined with their desired loiter time, speed, and altitude. Consequently, the Army realized they would not be able to have their cake and eat it too, and in the spring of 1983 they would withdraw from the program, subsequently causing the Air Force to also cut back from a desired 200 JVXs to only 80. With the now lack of Army funding possibly jeopardizing the program, the Defense Resources Board would hold a meeting that September and rule that the Army could safely withdraw, then consolidate the project under the Navy with a much smaller Air Force contribution. Then in December of 1983, the Army would decide to rejoin the program, but this time, they would ditch the more demanding SEMA mission and set up for 231 Army-specific Marine Corps versions made for a more standard role in transportation and logistics, bringing the expected total back up to 913.
Are you in or not?
They could now finally get to picking selections and awarding contracts, but the problem Hydra would rear yet another head as the military stopped and went, wait a minute, only one company has ever succeeded in making one of these planes before. That means we won't have any competing bids. That means there's nobody else to guarantee against risk if there are delays or cost overruns. That means they can just jack up the price without issue. That means they can swindle the ever-living shit out of us.
Oh yeah, it's all coming together.
Naturally, the military couldn't have that, and they were right about to take issue with it when, with somehow perfect timing, Boeing stepped up and proposed a joint venture contract with Bell, offloading some of the risk and making the project that much more acceptable. Bell would handle the wings, nacelles, rotors, drive system, and tail surfaces, while Boeing would use their experience in composite materials and cockpit design to make the fuselage, the avionics, and the flight controls. The partnership would also manage risk and timelines because if one delayed, the other would suffer, and full-scale development would then be authorized in December of 1986. But despite these victories, the program would still keep getting hit with setback after setback. Somewhere along the line between then and completion, the Army would again withdraw from the program, this time completely and permanently. And the only reason I can find for that is that even to this day, the Army and the Air Force fight each other to maintain some degree of distinction in their roles. The branch politics just never end. How does that saying go? International threats are just adversaries, the other branches of the enemy, or something like that? Oh my god. But basically, the Osprey would have too much overlap between the Air Force and the Army, so the Army opted out and pulled their 231 units out with them. The other branches would downshift their totals even further from there and eventually settle on 360 units for the Marines, 56 for the Air Force, and 48 for the Navy. Then the Osprey would start racking up its history of crashes. And while the V-22 is by no means the most unsafe vertical takeoff aircraft to have ever been made, the program would start getting a bad rap through a wombo combo of high per-crash fatality counts and corrupt practices. You probably thought I only called it a Decepticon because it transformed into a flying vehicle, huh? There's a reason that pilots also call it the Widowmaker. On June 11, 1991, a V-22A test flight lost proper roll control when they shifted to hovering mode and started bouncing all over the place. The pilot practically scampered onto the ground as best he could and then instinctively pushed the throttle forward to cut the power because on a helicopter you dump power by pushing the collective lever down, a control system which is also located exactly where the throttle is on a conventional aircraft. But Boeing forgot that V-22 pilots would need helicopter training to fly this thing and basically copy-pasted the throttle from a Harrier, which only works the opposite way. So instead the pilot takes off again and flops all over the place even more until the left rotor catches the ground and tears the prototype apart, somehow not killing anybody. And get this, the entire reason they lost roll control earlier was because somebody put the roll sensor in backwards. Somebody skipped a 2-second check and cost the program millions of dollars and almost cost 2 people their lives. So the sensor got fixed and they set up the control scheme to swap between hover and flight modes with a slight downwards tilt so pilots wouldn't goof it a second time. That would not become a repeat issue, but then another crash would happen anyways on July 20th, 1992, when a flammable fluid leak into the jet intake after switching to hover mode caused another test flight's right engine to audition for the role of a Roman candle, severing a composite drive shaft and keeling over into the Potomac River along with all 7 occupants aboard, right in front of an audience of Congress members and government officials.
Oh my God!
2 more issues came from this, 2 solvable and 1 not. The 2 they could fix included replacing the composite drive shafts with metal ones and changing the design to prevent leaks. But the thing they couldn't fix here was the psychic damage the Osprey dealt to its own reputation. The Osprey program got these crashes on lock for the next several years, which gave it enough confidence to begin low-rate initial production of the MV-22 Block A's, or just MV-22As, in 1997. And that bureaucratic Viagra lasted for all of 3 years. Operational testing began in the year 2000, and the Navy testers were proud to report that the MV-22 was both operationally effective and operationally suitable. For reference, the difference between effective and suitable is like the difference between asking the questions, does it work and can we use it? The Navy said yes to both. The DoD's independent evaluators, on the other hand, said, yeah, it works, but I don't think you should use it. And since they were indecisive, they said, alright, we got different answers, let's sort it out in December, with it being whether or not they were going to move the aircraft from the low-rate onesies and twosies production to the full send give me everything you got production. And in the time it took to get from then to the meeting, 3 more Ospreys got written off in 2 crashes and 23 more people died.
I'm No, God!
On April 8th, an Osprey pilot descended too quickly during a simulated rescue mission, and the right prop rotor stalled at 245 feet off the ground. How does a helicopter stall, you ask? Allow me to introduce you to the phenomenon known as the ring vortex stall, which I'm just going to shorten to RVS. If you look at the lift profile of a helicopter rotor, you're going to notice that it inverts and goes negative or close to it near the hub, because, well, you're not generating lift there, and the spinning blades also move the slowest towards the inside. If you descend too quickly, that no-lift zone widens and creates vortices over the blades, which screws up your airflow. And because of the more than 40-degree twist-up angle of the blades required for the prop rotor design, those vortices scream out from the middle of the blades to the tips like a bat out of hell and makes your entire rotor go from happy to happy meal in the blink of an eye. Moral of the story? Do not take your medicinal Osprey skydiving, because just like the one on April 8th, you will roll over at less than 250 feet and explode on impact. The detonation killed all 19 occupants and damaged a second Osprey flying nearby, just enough to smack it back into the ground. Nobody died in that one, but the aircraft still had to be written off. That resulted in a procedural update to ban descents faster than 4 meters per second with automatic warnings added to the cockpit. But then came another crash the same month as the meeting. On December 11th, another MV-22 had a hydraulic line failure, and it was at that moment that all 4 occupants realized that Scorpion from Mortal Kombat was secretly a Lorax, because he spoke for the trees and the trees said, "Get over here," as they proceeded to fall 1,600 feet into a forest. The after-action report revealed that apparently some genius had forgotten to program the fly-by-wire flight controls to figure out what to do if the hydraulics failed. So the control computer just threw its hands up and said,
I'm gonna go drink a gallon of rat poison. I'll be right back.
Naturally, they delayed the full-rate production. Then we get to the part where people say that the testing for the aircraft was rushed because they waived several operational testing requirements in 1999 to push it into service. But I'm not sure if I fully believe that, because the only place I was able to find that claim was the Project on Government Oversight, or POGO. And as I've stated multiple times before, I trust their line of reasoning on things about as much as I trust the noses on the judges of a skunk smelling contest. However, a broken clock might actually be right twice a day here, because Government Accountability Office reports noted that in 2001, the Osprey program modified the program requirements after several years of testing by consolidating 14 requirements for key performance metrics into 7 to balance against program risks and additional costs. And then they relaxed the mission capability rate to where they only had to meet the requirement after the Osprey airframe had already racked up 60,000 flight hours. And that report specifies that both of those are examples, meaning that while Pogo's claim was not directly cited there, it could be one of others that might still be on the table. But what's probably even more damning was a scandal in 2001 where 8 Marine Corps officers were charged with various crimes as a result of falsifying Osprey maintenance records, including a captain, 2 lieutenant colonels, 3 full bird colonels, and even a 2-star general. But after a few more crashes and a revamp of the platform, the MV-22B would undergo a second round of operational testing in June of 2005, which it would finally pass, and that September the Osprey would finally be approved for full-rate production and make its first delivery to the Marines that same year. Then the Air Force Special Operations Command, or AFSOC, would get a hold of their Ospreys for the first time that January, the CV-22s. And the Marine Corps Ospreys would reach the initial operating capability marker by 2007, right on time for a baptism of fire in Operation Iraqi Freedom. 10 MV-22Bs were deployed to theater, and battlefield commanders would immediately take note of how effective it was at moving whatever they wanted from point A to point B. It gave the deployed forces such a massive boost in air mobility for tactically repositioning troops, diplomats, and even medical supplies that field commanders were quoted as saying that the Osprey cut the battlefield in half. Meanwhile, back in the States, the Air Force CV-22s would reach their initial operating capability in 2009, and by March of next year, 5 of those were deployed to take part in the combat in Operation Enduring Freedom. America's Transformers would then take part in Operations Unified Response and Odyssey Dawn in 2010 and 2011, showing the world what it both can and can't do. Which begs the question, what can the Osprey do? Well, if you ask somebody for a rough comparison to its predecessor, the CH-46, they would tell you it has twice the speed, 6 times the range, and 3 times the payload. And speed and range are definitely its fortes. Each of these roughly $90 million Transformers can use its twin Rolls-Royce Liberty AE-110-7C turboprop engines with 6,150 shaft horsepower or 4.5 kilowatts each of power. These engines drive 38-foot prop rotors that turn the American Decepticons thrust machines into heavenly halos in a a sandstorm due to the sand sparking against the fast-moving blades. You know, just in case you needed a reminder that God has favorites and you aren't one of them. The Osprey uses these true angelic forms to reach a cruising speed of 240 knots, which is about 276 miles an hour if you don't speak pirate, and 444 metric knot miles an hour if you speak second-place moon landing. The FSOC CV-22s are a little slower at 230 knots, but the Marine Corps units have actually proven that manufacturers' specs are nothing more than suggestions, by demonstrating they can push it up to 15 knots faster than the specified speed.
Not to worry. I have a permit. This just says I can do what I want.
And these engines give the Osprey way better range than standard jets because turboprop engines are by far the most fuel-efficient type of jet engine. Yes, a turboprop engine is actually a propeller being jumper cabled by a jet turbine, because that's just how the old propeller folks get down nowadays when more thrust is needed. Wire up a drive shaft and get to pumping. This fuel economy lets it make use of its endurance, with the MV-22 carrying 1,721 gallons or 6,513 metric half-size soda bottles of internal gas, and the CV-22 gets a little extra at 2,025 gallons or 7,667 liters. This gives the MV-22 a specified combat radius of 200 nautical miles or 230 non-pirate miles, and a proven combat radius of 230 nautical miles or 265 landlubber miles. The CV-22 can also fit an internal auxiliary tank to take it even further, all the way out to 500 nautical miles, better known as 575 non-Miharti miles. But if it only needs to go one way, it can reach out and touch another landing strip as far away as 2,100 pirate miles in theory and 2,133 in practice. And on top of all that range, the 43% composite airframe is capable of moving 24 people in its onboard jump seats, with 8 more if you sit them on the floor. Alternatively, it can mix and match that with 20,000 pounds of internal cargo, or between 10 and 15,000 pounds on either 1 or 2 external tow hooks. All of that payload was originally only protected by a 50 caliber door gun, but back in 2009, the Marines purchased upgrades to make that an M240 SAW and then mounted a GAU-17 minigun on a belly turret, remote controlled by their friendly neighborhood Xbox player.
He was really fucking us up.
Killer
I died
with that knife
67
is a killer.
times.
All told, Uncle Sam's Megatron can take off from short runways loaded up to 57,000 pounds or 25,800 kilos. Or say screw gravity and go straight up with up to 52,600 pounds or 23,800 kilos. However, while the Osprey's sandy halos make it seem like divine intervention to friends and divine smite to foes, keeping this thing in action is hell on rotors for everyone involved. For starters, the max weights for both vertical and short takeoffs aren't the most it can carry. The Osprey's actual max flying weight is somewhere over 60,000 pounds, but it can't actually take off with all that because the plane would somehow have to level its 38-foot prop rotors, which would extend lower than the aircraft's landing gear, without the blades trying to no-clip glitch through the runway. Spoiler warning, the laws of physics admin is watching and it will ban your aircraft from reality.
Friendly Predator missile inbound.
And speaking of physics, as I said before, the prop rotor blades are called prop rotors because they have to be made for both forward flight and vertical flight, which are two completely different things. As a result, the Osprey's blades have these obscenely noticeable twist angles to help it cope better with forward flight at the cost of hover efficiency, which in turn prevents it from using a safety feature that most other helicopters have access to: auto rotation. Let's say for a moment you're flying a helicopter and you completely lose power to the big fan up top, immediately start sweating. You are going to be able to slow your descent a little bit, because as the air starts rushing up through the propeller, it starts turning it the other way. That in turn actually generates some lift through a weird bell-shaped curved drag profile and provides enough lift to help you safely put the chopper on the ground from a decently high enough altitude. But that's only possible because of the much more gentle twist in a standard chopper's rotor blade design. The Osprey may have a drive shaft running through the wings to power both prop rotors on one engine if it has to, but if the drive shaft goes, or both engines go, or if the type of engine failure just makes it a non-factor entirely, you will either find that your ride has spontaneously converted into a glider, or you are about to land 6 feet in the ground.
The good news is we'll be landing immediately. Bad news is we're crash landing.
Then the other issue with having to compromise between rotors and propellers is that you have to make the blades short so you don't break the sound barrier at the tips like some kind of knockoff thunder screech, because the blades move faster at the outside than they do at the inside. This meant that the overall area to generate lift with is smaller, which creates a higher disc loading, and that is the exact same concept as an aircraft's wing loading. Smaller is better, and the Osprey's is way bigger, which in turn creates problems like the nearly Category 2 hurricanes created from its downwash. The V-22's downwash creates wind speeds of 80 knots or 92 miles an hour. That is fast enough to make a stationary P-51 Mustang take off. The irony is not lost on me that this thing was inspired by a military operation that failed partially because of a sandstorm, and yet it will give you a free sandstorm anywhere you go with bonus visibility issues free of charge. And those flying fog generators are mounted to a pair of wings that had to be forward swept slightly to both save weight and avoid colliding with the blades. But they're also tilted upwards slightly because the carrier deck is the real place where the V-22 turns into an Autobot. In order to compact into a tighter package on the carrier decks, not only do the wings pivot to be in line with the rest of the airplane, but just like the other carrier choppers, the rotor blades fold up and tuck in along one side. However, while it can be very compact for its size, it's still larger than the CH-46 it was supposed to replace. And when you take up more than one seat on the airplane while being as high maintenance as the Osprey, you also tend to take up more of the overhead boxes. Thanks to the V-22's complexity and the number of moving parts, it needs a lot of space dedicated to storing just its baggage of replacements on a ship, where legroom is a premium. Some of these parts are so bulky they have to be stored on land and ferried over when needed. I suppose it's a good thing they can't carry as many Ospreys in the first place, both because they're bigger and because only 4 of the 6 landing pads the Sea Knight could use are actually usable by the Osprey, which is mostly because the engines run like the surface of the sun. When the Osprey is in vertical takeoff mode, it needs specially prepared heat-resistant pads and decks to take off from so it doesn't burn a hole in whatever refined dirt plate is keeping it off of Mother Nature's property.
Get off my property.
These parts issues, especially considering how horribly immature and underdeveloped any brand new supply chain is, made the Osprey an absolute pain to keep up and running when it got sent to Operation Iraqi Freedom pretty much right after reaching IOC. Good commanders think tactics, but great commanders think logistics, and if you need an example of why logistics matter in warfare, look no further than the Osprey's early performance in Iraqi Freedom. According to the GAO, the Government Accountability Office, by January 1st, 2009, the 3 squadrons of MV-22s in Iraq had a mission capability or MC rates of 68, 57, and 61%. All of these were below the required minimum MC rate of 82%, all thanks to those new and underdeveloped supply chains, while older choppers had an average capability rate of 85% or more. And while the lower readiness level was unfortunately a common issue across all Osprey squadrons, whether they were deployed or not, the full mission capability or FMC rates were absolutely atrocious. The required minimum in-theater FMC rate they were supposed to have was 75%, but between October of 2007 and April of 2008, the Ospreys only clocked in at 6%. Not 60, not 16, 6. Just for reference, okay, the engines on the Osprey were supposed to have a service life of 500 to 600 hours, and it could have just been the sand, but the average engine replacement time in theater occurred at 400 hours instead. At that point, setting the requirement for fully matured mission capability rates at 60,000 hours was just shooting themselves in the foot, because by the time those capability rate stats were taken, they had already hit 50,000 hours. And that was only 2 years after reaching IOC. Unfortunately, the Osprey's limitations extend to functionality as well, because speed and range appear to be the only major benefits it has to offer. The flying transformer might have been made for 24 grunts, but in practice it got ratcheted down to 20, because in the amount of time it took for the Osprey to get off the drawing board and onto the field, the average weight of a fully kitted Marine had risen from 240 pounds to 400 pounds. Forget reaching even that many if you want to carry a buggy or something else inside, or even outside for that matter. While the Osprey can carry a lot of stuff farther and faster, the majority of external loads aren't rated to be pulled along through the air like a cartoon character with the cheeks flapping through the wind. Factor in the poor hovering efficiency, and if you need to tow strap a cargo nutsack to drag around, the V-22s just aren't your best bet. But at least it could put people down anywhere it wants, right? While it is claimed that it has operated in high-threat environments, the GAO reports noted that while in hovering flight, the Osprey had, quote, maneuvering limits that restrict its ability to perform defensive maneuvers. Although, to be fair to the Osprey, the report doesn't go into any detail on what that means. That report did note, however, that it lacked enough defensive weapon power to suppress enemy fire, which I wouldn't count on it to take much of anyways, because it doesn't walk off anything more than a 50 cal. The saw and the machine gun gun were added as a result of this note to give the Osprey better suppressing fire capability, but the last issues were without a doubt the most subtle, which can very easily make them the most deadly. For one, the Osprey's cabin environmental control system had numerous faulty seals uncovered in operational testing and consequently wouldn't be used all that often. Then there was the unreliable de-icing system, the non-existent weather radar, and a significant lack of hovering performance above 10,000 feet. All in all, the original version of Uncle Sam's Decepticons couldn't fly in anything other than clear skies, couldn't fly above 10,000 feet, couldn't pressurize their cabin, and couldn't protect their crew from environments contaminated with radioactive, chemical, or biological warfare agents. These are some pretty bad weaknesses, and so all that experience from Iraqi Freedom and the other operations it went on would give way to the Osprey's latest form to address them. On February 14, 2012, the first MV-22 Block C or MV-22Cs would be bestowed upon Uncle Sam's misguided children. These latest Ospreys got the environmental control systems and de-icing systems fixed, plus the addition of forward-firing countermeasures, weather radar so they could fly through a sandstorm, finally, night vision displays in the cockpit, and a situational awareness station for commanders to make mission updates mid-flight. The Marines would receive 151 of them, and all 129 MV-22Bs would start getting the C models upgrades in 2018 via the V-22 Common Configuration Readiness and Modernization, or CCRAM program. Not only would this give them some of those vastly needed safety improvements and air conditioning, but it would also make maintenance requirements easier, because the Block B Ospreys are like some Russian tank variants, as in some of the apparently 70 different configurations made during production can only be told apart by as little as a few wires and bolts. That means possibly more unique maintenance needs and more supply issues and consequently more expenses, which are not ideal when the aircraft already has both the media and Congress breathing down its neck.
Oh, what do you got there?
So lots of slightly different aviation puzzle pieces is not a good idea, and the Marines want to cut the configuration totals down from 70 to just 5 by 2030. But in the meantime, Marine Squadron HMX-1, the squadron that handles presidential transport, would get its first specialized Osprey in May of 2013, and then the Navy would finally get a hold of their Ospreys and reach initial operating capability on the 14th of December 2021. The CMV-22B changed somewhere along the development road and went from being a search and rescue platform to Navy Amazon. This salty dog is a carrier on-board delivery aircraft, which in other words means it takes resupply shipments and next day delivers them straight to the front door of your aircraft carrier, moving 6,000 pounds of cargo up to 1,150 nautical miles, aka just over 1,300 land lumber miles or almost 2,200 metric knot miles. However, the Osprey isn't unique to the United States anymore. In July of 2015, Japan would become the first export customer for the Osprey, buying 5 of them and eventually expanding the order to 17. Which makes sense. I mean, Japan actually had a hand in the creation of some of the first Transformers toys. They've been about cool shape-shifting sequences for decades at this point, and suddenly America turns around and offers them the closest thing at the time to a Gundam. Of course they're gonna get some. However, they would delay taking possession of them from 2018 to July 10th, 2020 due to concerns over its well-publicized early safety record. This likely changed when they realized most of the mishaps since development resulted in no fatalities. In fact, in the 20 years between 2000 and 2020, only 6 incidents resulted in any fatalities at all, with 4 people killed at most in each case for a total of 12. Of the 35 incidents logged in the aviation safety network during that time, 11 resulted in write-offs and 9 received substantial but reparable damage.
Don't worry, Captain, we'll buff out those scratches.
But those crash frequencies would get worse, and the reason it has such a bad reputation now is that in the 5 years since 2020, there have been no fewer than 25 incidents reported. Of these, 3 were write-offs, 2 were substantially damaged, and 4 of those crashes resulted in a total of 20 fatalities. The most well-publicized of these being the 8-fatality crash near Yakushima Island in Japan, where the gears wore through and the pilot then decided to land at one of the furthest air bases in his immediate vicinity. However, 14 of the logged incidents are reported as having unknown damage, because they pretty much all consist of Ospreys making emergency landings due to cockpit warnings that were then fixed and flying either days or weeks later, with only one of them resulting in any noted damage thanks to an engine fire, which occurred before takeoff. 4 of these 25 incidents belong to the Gundam Ospreys, but none of those resulted in anything other than minor known damages, and no Japanese service members have been lost. Unfortunately, that well-publicized crash following the several-year uptick in cockpit warnings convinced the US to ground its entire fleet of roughly 348 MV-22s, 52 CV-22s, and 44 CMV-22Bs in 2023. Even the presidential Osprey would be grounded in late 2024, also after an engine fire before takeoff. However, the DoD kept shying away from presenting the crash data that Congress had requested on the 21st of December the year before, to the point that on July 16, 2024, Congress would threaten the DoD with a subpoena to fork it over. And that data, which was summarized in the Marine Aviation Plan for 2025, makes the issue not feel like that big of a worry, because as of August 1st, 2024, the Class A mishap rate, in other words, the rate of crashes where fatalities and/or over $1 million in damage was involved, was an average of 3.15 mishaps for every 100,000 flight hours. That puts it lower than the Marine Corps average of 3.24 mishaps per 100,000 hours, and the total fatalities caused are also a fraction of those lost to either the Black Hawk or the Chinook helicopters, even out of combat.
Could be worse.
And if you're wondering why they were still so hesitant to hand over the data if it wasn't that bad, well, I can tell you right now, if you give Congress an inch, they'll take a mile. No information to Congress means nothing they can use. Nothing they can use means no warped arguments that'll let them force some stupid idea into play for a cheap power grab. The military's already trying to fix the issue themselves like adults, they don't need some clown treating them like kids. And thanks to what we know about the recent uptick in alarms and incidents, they have enough problems to worry about without shooing Congress away from the table. Sometimes it's the hydraulic motors used to turn the engines that have failures. Sometimes it's the hard clutch engagement, which sounds like it should be the name of a sex tape, but it's actually the clutch slipping and triggering a failsafe that engages the emergency drive shaft power transfer, only to re-engage immediately and cause a massive torque spike that's basically like grinding the gears on a stick shift.
Sounds too kinky for me.
At least partially due to this, there have been a lot of recent gearbox failures, which are tracked by onboard chip detectors. As gears wear down, they shed small chips of metal materials, which contaminates the oil used for lubrication, but it becomes an expensive pain in the nuts to open that thing up every time and check. So the engines have what are effectively magnets in the oil piping to attract the metal chips and melt them with electrical currents in the oil flow. But if these detectors pull in too big a chip, it sets off an alarm to alert the pilot, which is probably what most of those unknown alerts were. Both this information and the word on the street from some mechanics I know make it pretty clear that the deadly Decepticon has been wearing through its parts a lot faster than it should be. Maintenance windows, especially for the drive shafts, are now a fraction of what would be ideal, and this whole issue implies that someone either intentionally or unintentionally made a major miscalculation in the cyclic loading and fatigue rate calculations made during damage tolerance analysis. Damage tolerance analysis, or DTA, is a category of engineering calculations that specifically addresses the tendency of materials to weaken under constant on-off stresses. These issues can cause materials to fail under loads well below what they should be able to sustain otherwise. Think about a paperclip. If you bend it back and forth enough times, it will eventually break into two pieces. Scale that up by a couple 100,000 rotations and you get the wear and tear that a drive shaft has to work with on a daily basis, regardless of application.
Like breaking a toothpick.
It feels to me like a lot of the evidence here points to the engine nacelles just being way too heavy. I mean, think about it. The engine assembly is 9 times out of 10 the heaviest part of any aircraft, period, not to mention where all the thrust is made. And the Osprey took 2 of them, stuck them as far outboard as they had to make it work, and then made them move. The entire concept screams an unholy level of wear and tear, period, and it's probably why Bell's newest tilt rotor project, the V-280 Valor, has engines that only flex halfway. And speaking of new stuff, the Osprey isn't. On March 24, 2021, the entire V-22 program reached a combined total of 600,000 flight hours, and it has been doubling the flight hours of any other rotary wing aircraft nearly every year. And this year, 2025, will be the 20th anniversary of the first Osprey ever delivered. This is not a new plane. It's going to see maintenance issues eventually, but like the military said, they weren't supposed to happen this soon. There appears to be some speculation about replacing it, but nothing is really firm or announced yet. And while limited Osprey flights have resumed as of March 2025, the majority of the Decepticon fleet will stay down until January 2026, when they finally start fielding a new gearbox system to replace the old one. They're also going to get rid of that mid-air refueling modification they were going to add for topping off the F-35Bs, which, frankly, great idea. I can hear the F-35 stall warning alarms from here. But hopefully those new patches to the Osprey game will make it a lot less likely to crash. Fingers crossed. So in summation, if you're a bad guy, be careful how you swing in America, or the grunts will turn fantasy into reality just to speed up cleaning you off the map so they can go back to sleep. And if you're an Osprey maintainer, good luck and I hope you have a good drinking buddy. Thank you for watching. We got merch and other links in the description, and if you like what you saw, please consider checking out some of my other videos. You might like what you find. Until next time, dismissed.